The wind didn't howl that day. It whispered, sharp and relentless, slicing through Cold Creek like a blade honed by winter's breath. The town itself seemed to shrink beneath the gray sky, its wooden buildings leaning inward as if sharing secrets of desperation. Dust clung to everything: boots, fences, the frayed edges of Caleb Holt's coat. As he rode in, his horse's hooves crunching over frozen mud. He'd come for grain, and a wagon will part, nothing more. His jaw was set, eyes fixed on the horizon where the plains met the sky in a seamless line of bleakness. Grief had carved a hollow in his chest where hope once flickered, and the grave of his wife, Alice, still wore the fresh scent of turned earth beneath the cottonwood tree. His ranch, a skeletal shadow of what it once was, waited for him miles away, its debts gnawing at his ribs like hunger. But then he saw her. The alley behind the saloon was a gash of shadows, the air thick with the sour tang of whiskey and sweat. A crowd huddled there, their faces half hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats and scarves, eyes darting to the ground as though guilt could be buried there. They murmured in low tones, their voices swallowed by the wind. At the center stood Hannah Lyle, barefoot on cracked earth, her spine rigid despite the weight of the child she carried. Her dress hung loose, patched and muddied, the fabric clinging to her thin frame like a second skin. Her swollen belly jutted forward, a stark contrast to the hollows beneath her cheekbones, her lips chapped and colorless. Blonde hair, tangled and windblown, framed a face too pale for summer's end. She didn't flinch when the bearded man beside her shoved a Winchester rifle into Caleb's hands, the metal cold and heavy. "She ain't worth the trouble," the man sneered, his breath reeking of rot and whiskey. Coins clinked into a leather pouch at his belt, a sound sharp enough to slice through the silence. Caleb didn't answer, his eyes locked on hers, pale, unblinking, and utterly still. No tears, no tremble, just a silence so thick it drowned the world around her, as if she'd folded her soul into a box and buried it deep. The merchant spat, turning away. No preacher here. The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and final. Caleb's throat tightened. Why'd he care? Alice's ghost lingered in every corner of his mind. The way she'd laughed before the fever stole her breath. The way their child's tiny hand had curled around his finger before being laid to rest beside her. His ranch was crumbling, his pockets near empty, and yet something in Hannah's silence, a wound he recognized from his own bones, made his boots move. $1.50 and the rifle. The bearded man growled, spittle flying as he spoke. Caleb's hand went to his coat, fingers brushing the pouch of coins he'd saved for feed and repairs. "What are you doing?" The voice in his head sounded like his dead father's, stern and weary. He tossed the pouch, unhooked the rifle, and stepped forward. "Her name?" he demanded. The man scoffed, narrowing his eyes. "Does it matter?" It did. When she whispered Hannah Lyle, the world shifted. Her voice was cracked, barely audible, but it cut through the numbness like a blade. A name, a voice, a person, not a burden, not a debt. Her. Caleb held out his hand, calloused and steady. Hannah didn't take it, but she walked toward him, one foot in front of the other, like a woman stepping off a cliff into a fog she couldn't see through. The wagon creaked as they left the town behind, wheels groaning under the weight of unspoken words. Dust swirled in their wake, clinging to the hem of her dress and the creases of Caleb's coat. He glanced at her, silent, staring ahead, hands folded over the life inside her. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows that stretched across the prairie like scars. He cleared his throat, the sound raw. "You don't owe me nothing." She didn't answer, but her fingers twitched, a flicker of movement as fleeting as a heartbeat. What would make a man buy a stranger in auction? What ghosts did he carry? The specter of Alice's cinnamon freckles, the echo of a child's uncried breath. And what secrets lay behind Hannah's silence? The wind howled again, but neither spoke. Ahead, The horizon blurred into a haze of uncertainty, the road stretching onward like a question with no answer yet. The riverbed stretched wide and shallow, its stones glazed with frost under a sky pocked with stars. The air bit sharp, carrying the metallic scent of winter's edge, and the fire Caleb built crackled like a nervous heartbeat in the silence. He handed Hannah his coat without a word, watching as she pulled it tight around her thin frame. The fabric swallowed her, but she didn't complain. She ate slowly, methodically, as though chewing each bite was an obligation rather than a comfort. Her eyes never met his, fixed instead on the flames, as if the fire held answers she couldn't voice. When she finally spoke, her voice was brittle, like thin ice underfoot. They weren't always cruel. The words hung between them, raw and unexpected. Caleb froze, the log he'd been whittling slipping from his hands. The fire snapped, sending sparks spiraling into the dark. Hannah's fingers drifted to her belly, the motion almost unconscious. They said I was a burden after Micah died. Said my husband's death made me worthless. Her voice wavered, but she pressed on, as if unspooling the truth might finally untangle the knot inside her. They sold me because they thought I'd curse them. Caleb's jaw clenched so hard it ached. Alice's face flashed in his mind, the way she'd laughed until her freckles crinkled, the way she'd hummed as she folded laundry, the way her breath had rasped out in the final days. Their child's face followed, a memory so sharp it cut. A boy, he thought. We never even named him. They were wrong, he muttered, the words too small to hold the fury he felt. Hannah looked at him then, really looked, her pale eyes locking onto his, searching for something she couldn't name. Why'd you do it? He hesitated. The truth clawed at his throat. Because I saw Alice in your silence. Because you're still breathing and she isn't. And maybe saving you keeps me from drowning. But the confession stuck too raw to give shape. Instead, he rolled out a blanket, lay on the hard ground, and stared at the stars. Sleep, he said, as if the night would obey. But neither did. Hours passed in aching stillness. The fire dimmed to embers, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts over Hannah's still form. Caleb heard her shift, felt her exhale tremble into the cold. Then, barely audible, she whispered, "Thank you." He didn't answer. Couldn't. His throat tightened as he stared at the stars, wondering if redemption was even possible in a world that chewed up women like her and men like him. Could ashes bloom? Could guilt turn to grace? The questions gnawed, unanswered, as the wind hissed through the trees. By morning, fog swallowed the world whole. It clung to the earth like a shroud, thick and suffocating, blurring the line between sky and soil. Hannah curled on the blanket, arms wrapped around herself, her breath visible in the damp air. She looked smaller somehow, as though the night's confessions had stripped her down to her bones. Caleb stood abruptly, grabbing an axe and striding toward the stack of wood he'd gathered hours earlier. The blade bit into the logs, each swing a rhythmic rebellion against the silence. Chop, crack, split, not for warmth, not for the stove, for the noise, for the ache in his arms that drowned out the ache in his chest. When Hannah woke, he poured coffee into 2 tin cups, the steam curling like ghosts into the fog. "We'll reach the ranch by sundown," he said, handing her a cup. She nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she took it. The mule snorted nearby, pawing at the ground, its breath visible in the cold. Trees loomed like specters beyond the campsite, their skeletal branches clawing at the haze. Caleb leaned back against a log, staring at the horizon he couldn't see. "I was raised in Kansas," he began, the words hesitant, as though testing the air. "Dustier than here. Meaner, too." He glanced at Hannah. She was listening, her fingers curled tightly around the cup, her knuckles pale. "My father was a preacher. My mother died birthing my sister. She didn't last past 6 winters." The fog muffled his voice, but Hannah leaned closer, as if proximity might help her hold the fragments of his past. I left at 16, he continued. Thought I'd find gold. Found cattle instead. A bitter chuckle escaped him. My wife, Alice, she was better than I ever deserved. Could outshoot me with a rifle and outmake any woman in the county. He paused, the memory of her cinnamon freckles burning behind his eyes. We lost our first child in the spring frost. She passed 2 months later. The silence that followed was heavy, but not empty. Hannah's fingers clenched in her lap, her gaze fixed on the distant murmur of the river. She didn't speak, but her shoulders softened as though his grief had mirrored hers, binding them in ways words never could. When she finally turned to him, her voice was barely above a whisper. I used to hum, she said, when I was a girl. I haven't in a long time. Caleb nodded, the admission settling deep in his chest. Maybe you will again. She didn't answer, but as they packed the wagon and the fog began to lift, he caught the faintest sound, a broken, brave hum drifting through the air. It was nothing more than a breath, but it was a beginning. The road ahead was long, the ranch still hours away, but in that moment, the silence between them felt less like armor and more like soil. Frostbitten? Yes, but waiting. Ready. The ranch house loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged against the fading light like a scar carved into the horizon. Its weathered planks were bleached by years of sun and grit, the porch sagging under the weight of neglect. Or perhaps the invisible burden of Caleb's unspoken failures. Each step closer felt heavier, the creak of the wagon wheels echoing in his ears like a dirge. He glanced at Hannah, her posture rigid as he helped her down, his hands lingering just a second too long before releasing her. She moved slowly, deliberately, as though testing the earth beneath her boots, her swollen belly a pendulum of uncertainty. Would the ground hold her? Caleb wondered. Would he? This is home, he said, the word tasting foreign, brittle. It wasn't a welcome. Not yet. Just a fact laid bare. Hannah paused at the doorway, her fingers grazing the edge of Alice's quilt, still draped over the bed like a ghost refusing to fade. The fabric shimmered faintly in the lamplight, its patchwork stitched with the precision of a woman who had once hummed as she worked. Hannah's voice was soft, almost reverent. I can take the barn tonight. A compromise, a shield. Anything to avoid claiming space that didn't feel hers to occupy. Caleb shook his head, his throat tight. You rest. The words came gruff, but his eyes softened as they swept over her. The dark smudges beneath her own, the tremor in her hand she tried to hide. He didn't know what to do with the ache her presence stirred in him. Part guilt, part grief, part something unnamed that clawed at his ribs. But Hannah wasn't helpless. She moved through the house with quiet purpose, washing her face in the basin he'd left by the stove, folding the quilt with meticulous care, and sitting stiffly to eat the stew he'd warmed. She ate like a phantom learning to exist again, mechanical, yet deliberate, as though proving she could still occupy her own body. When she finally spoke, her voice was a threadbare whisper. His name was Micah. He wasn't cruel, just tired. Her gaze dropped to her hands, knuckles pale around the tin spoon. He died of fever after the child quickened. Caleb's hand stilled mid-chop, the knife hovering above the block. The fire crackled, casting long shadows that danced like specters across the walls. He saw Alice's face in the flicker of flames, the way she'd clung to hope even as the fever stole her breath. They said I brought the sickness, Hannah continued, her voice steadier now, sharpened by old wounds. That I ate more than I worked. Her eyes met his, raw and unflinching. They call me a curse. The silence between them thickened, heavy with the weight of all they didn't say. Caleb swallowed hard, his callous thumb brushing the wooden handle of the knife. I'm sorry, he muttered, though the words felt inadequate, a balm for a wound too deep to heal. You don't know me, she countered, not bitterly, but with the quiet finality of someone accustomed to being unseen. Don't need to, he replied, the admission slipping out before he could cage it. His jaw tightened, as if daring her to challenge him. The words hung suspended, fragile yet unyielding. Then, abruptly, Hannah asked, "Are you still going to make me your wife?" Her tone was neither accusatory nor pleading, just a question stripped of pretense, as though she needed to name the elephant in the room to make it shrink. Caleb shook his head, the motion slow, deliberate. "Only if you ask." He turned back to the stove, stirring the stew with a vigor it didn't require, as if the act could drown out the vulnerability in his own voice. "I won't," she said flatly, though her fingers twitched in her lap, betraying the lie. "Then I won't push." Days passed in a rhythm neither named aloud, but both felt, a tenuous dance of proximity and distance. Hannah swept floors with methodical precision, her broom carving arcs in the dust, like a cartographer mapping uncharted land. She cooked sparse meals, her hands learning the lay of his kitchen, the creak of the pantry door, the way the iron stove hissed when fed. Most afternoons, she sat on the porch, her silhouette framed by the golden haze of the plains, staring at nothing. Or perhaps at everything. The horizon where her old life ended, the wind that carried whispers of the past, the unborn child who tied her to this strange, uncertain future. Caleb kept his distance, yet watched. He noticed how she lingered near the mule's stall, her palm grazing the animal's nose as if seeking solace in its dumb silence. He noted the way she folded laundry twice, smoothing wrinkles no one would see, her fingers tracing seams as though stitching herself back together. Then came the evening that shifted the air, a subtle, seismic thing. She emerged from the kitchen with a tin cup of coffee, steam curling around her face like a veil. Wordlessly, she held out to him. He blinked, taking it carefully, the warmth seeping into his palms. "Thank you," he said, the gratitude gruff but genuine. She didn't retreat. Instead, she stood near enough for him to feel the heat of her presence, the faint scent of lavender clinging to her skin. "I used to hum," she said, the confession tentative, as though testing the edges of a long dormant muscle. "When I was a girl." Caleb nodded, sipping his coffee to give himself time to reply. "Maybe you will again." The next morning, as he split wood near the barn, a sound drifted through the open window, a broken, brave hum, trembling but true. It wrapped around the creak of the wind, the rustle of dry grass, weaving itself into the bones of the house. Caleb froze, the axe poised mid-swing, his breath catching in his throat. The melody was faint, frayed at the edges, but it was there, a crack in the silence, letting light spill through. Inside, Hannah stood at the sink, humming as she rinsed a cloth, her voice quivering like a fledgling bird testing its wings. She didn't know he'd heard, didn't know that the sound lodged in his chest like a promise, that redemption, when it came, wouldn't roar or demand. It would hum. It would linger in the spaces between them, patient, waiting to be claimed. And Caleb, standing in the frostbitten yard, let the axe sink to his side as he closed his eyes. For the first time in years, the silence between his ribs felt less like a void and more like soil. Cold, yes, but ripe with the stubborn roots of beginning again. Rain came hard that night, the kind that fell in sheets, drumming against the tin roof like 1,000 restless fingers. Thunder rolled low and heavy, echoing across the plains like distant cannon fire, shaking the walls of the ranch house as if testing their resolve. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and lingering smoke from the stove. Hannah stood in the doorway of the bedroom, her silhouette framed by the dim lamplight. Her voice trembled when she spoke, but the words carried the weight of a question that had been gnawing at her since the day Caleb had walked into that alley in Cold Creek. "Do you believe in second chances?" Caleb set down his knife, the blade clinking softly against the wooden table. He studied her face, the shadows under her eyes, the way her fingers gripped the doorframe, as though steadying herself against the storm outside. "I think they believe in us," he said slowly, the phrase raw and unpolished, like the truth itself. She stepped into the light, her shoulders squared, the swell of her belly pressing against the fabric of her dress like a promise. "You've been kind," she said, her voice steadier now, though her eyes betrayed the tremor beneath her words. "But I'm still afraid." "So am I," he admitted, the confession slipping out before he could cage it. The silence that followed was thick, but not oppressive. It hung between them like a thread stretched taut, neither willing to let it snap. "I don't want to be owned," she said, her gaze unwavering. "You're not. I don't want to be saved." "Then just stay." The words settled into the room like dust after a long ride, softening the edges of the space around them. Hannah hesitated, then reached across the table, not for his hand, but to press her palm beside his, close enough for the warmth of her skin to seep into his bones. A nearness, a beginning. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shutters, but inside, something fragile held still, a moment suspended in the quiet understanding that neither of them had to outrun their ghosts. They only had to face them together. Spring came early that year, melting the frost from the ground and coaxing crocuses through the thawed earth. Hannah stood barefoot on the porch one morning, her toes curling against the rough planks as she leaned into the rail. One hand rested on her belly, the other gripping the post as if anchoring herself to the land. Caleb watched her from the field, the mule's rein slack in his hands as he paused mid-step. The sight of her, sunlight catching in her tangled hair, her shoulders less hunched, her breath steady, softened something in his chest that had long felt petrified. She planted tomatoes along the fence line, her movements deliberate as she tucked each seedling into the soil, her fingers working the earth like a woman reclaiming pieces of herself. Caleb built the cradle in the shed, his hands shaping the wood slow and clean, each stroke a silent vow to the child who would soon arrive. Townsfolk gossiped, of course. Whispers of the woman once sold at auction, the rancher who'd bought her, the strange quiet that lingered between them. But Caleb didn't care. Let them talk. Their lives were being carved in soil and sweat, not rumors. Until the knock came. It was late, too late for neighbors. Caleb stood from the table, his chair scraping against the floorboards as he reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. Hannah froze, her hand hovering over her belly as the knock echoed again, sharper this time. When he opened the door, 3 men stood outside, their hats pulled low against the dusk. The brother-in-law was among them, his narrow eyes gleaming with the same smug cruelty that had sold Hannah like cattle. "Evenin', Holt," the man drawled, spitting into the dirt. "We're here for what's ours." Caleb's grip tightened on the rifle. Hannah stepped behind him, her voice cold as winter. "I'm not your death." The man spat again, his grin twisting. "You're carrying family blood." "She told you no," Caleb said, his voice low and steady. "That ought to be enough." The door slammed shut, the sound sharp as a gunshot. Hannah didn't tremble. Not then. Not even when the brother-in-law's sneer lingered in the air like a curse. But later, on the porch as the stars blinked through the clearing sky, she whispered, "I'm scared." "So am I," Caleb replied, his voice rough but steady. He sat beside her on the creaking swing, the wood groaning beneath their weight. The wind stirred the lavender she'd planted, its faint scent mingling with the dampness of the storm. Hannah stared at the horizon, her fingers brushing the ribbon tied in her braid. A small, defiant splash of color against the gray. Caleb watched her profile, the way her jaw clenched, the way her hand never left her belly. They didn't speak again, but the silence between them was no longer armor. It was soil, fertile and waiting, ready to grow whatever came next. The fire came like a thief in the night, silent until it wasn't. A slow, creeping thing that slithered from the edge of the fields and found breath in the dry hay. Caleb smelled it first, acrid, sharp clawing at his throat. He bolted upright in bed, the sheets tangled around his legs, heart jackhammering as smoke curled beneath the door. "Hannah!" he barked, already shoving his boots onto his feet. Her voice answered, tight and steady, from the doorway. The barn. No time for coats, no time for words. He grabbed a shotgun. She clutched her belly with one hand and his arm with the other, and they ran. The barn was already a cage of flames, the rafters groaning under the heat. Sparks rained down like angry stars, igniting the dust in the air. The mule screamed, tethered inside, its hooves drumming against the wooden walls in frantic rhythm. Caleb didn't think. He kicked open the door, coat yanked over his head to shield his face, lungs searing as he lunged for the rope. Hannah shouted his name, her voice a blade through the chaos, but he didn't stop. The beam crashed behind him, a thunderclap of embers, as he sliced the rope and slapped the mule's flank. It bolted, wild-eyed, dragging him stumbling into the night. Hannah caught him halfway to the porch, her grip iron as he coughed, smoke curling from his sleeves. Neighbors arrived with buckets and rough hands, but it was too late. The barn collapsed in on itself, a skeletal heap of ash and memory. Clara pressed bread into Hannah's hands, the young storekeeper's feet bare and blackened from sprinting. Someone murmured about a rider seen fleeing into the hills, but no names were spoken. None were needed. Caleb stared at the smoldering ruins, jaw tight, fists clenched. Hannah's voice cut through the haze the next morning, steady as a plow line. "They want to break us." Her hand hovered near her belly, fingers trembling but resolute. Caleb poured water into a tin cup, setting it before her like an offering. "They won't," he said, the words a vow carved into the marrow of his bones. She believed him, not because the world was kind, but because his shoulders hadn't sagged, because his eyes hadn't flinched. Together, they'd built more than walls. Weeks later, the dawn broke blood orange as labor seized Hannah in its grip. It came sudden and savage, a storm no one could predict. She gritted her teeth, nails digging into the bedpost until her knuckles bled white, screams swallowed by the howling wind. Caleb moved like a man possessed, boiling water, tearing cloth into strips, shouting for Clara to ride for the midwife. When the baby's cry finally pierced the room, raw and furious, it drowned out every shadow, the fire, the threats, the graves they'd left behind. A boy, dark-haired and wailing, was pressed to her chest. Hannah wept, her body spent, but her eyes alive, wide with triumph. Caleb stepped outside, the weight of the moment too vast to hold. He stared at the sun, its light bleeding across the plains, and whispered Alice's name. Not to mourn, but to thank her. For the cradle in the shed. For the soil that grew lavender. For the silence that had taught him to listen. The weeks after blurred into a rhythm of ash and renewal. They rebuilt the barn with splintered hands and neighborly grit. Hannah planted tomatoes along the fence, her swollen ankles buried in dirt, the baby swaddled at her hip. At dusk, she hummed, broken tunes at first, then whole ones, as Caleb rocked the boy in his arms, the child's laughter a second sunrise. One evening, she found him staring at the cottonwood tree where Alice lay. "She'd have liked you," he muttered, unsure if he meant the grave or the woman beside him. Hannah didn't answer, just laced her fingers with his, their calluses matching like puzzle pieces. The fire had taken walls, but it had left roots. And in the end, roots were what held a family. They rebuilt the barn plank by splintered plank, their hands raw from nails and sweat. Caleb's back ached with the weight of timber, but he didn't stop. Not when the wind howled through the gaps or when the memory of fire still clung to the air. Hannah worked beside him, her movements careful but deliberate, her belly now a rounded certainty against the coarse fabric of her dress. She carried water, handed him tools without being asked, and once, when he stumbled from exhaustion, she pressed a cup of coffee into his hands and said nothing. The silence between them had changed. It no longer shielded wounds, but cradled resolve. By the time the last shingle was nailed, the barn stood not as a monument to what was lost, but as a testament to what they clawed back from the ashes. Hannah planted lavender along the porch steps, her fingers burying roots in the soil like she was stitching the land to her skin. She hummed as she worked, the sound tentative at first, then fuller, as if the notes had been trapped in her chest for years. The scent lingered in the air, soft and stubborn, weaving itself into the fabric of the ranch. Caleb noticed how she paused to crush a sprig between her fingers, inhaling as though the fragrance anchored her to this life. "It reminds me of my mother's garden," she said one evening, her voice casual but her eyes distant. He didn't press her. He just nodded, watching the way the purple blooms swayed in the dusk, their resilience a quiet echo of her own. The baby laughed, a sudden, bright sound that shattered the stillness of the house. It came in bursts, startled and fierce, as Caleb bounced the boy in his arms, his calloused fingers brushing the soft curve of the child's cheek. Hannah would freeze mid-task, her breath catching as if the sound were a miracle she hadn't dared hope for. The laughter spilled into corners where grief had once pooled, filling cracks in walls and hearts alike. Even mules seemed to perk up, nuzzling the baby's tiny fist when Hannah carried him to the paddock. The townsfolk, too, stopped whispering. They still stared when the couple rode into Cold Creek. Hannah's chin lifted, her hand resting on the rifle strapped to her saddle. But their murmurs had shifted from suspicion to grudging respect. Clara left Jam on their porch step without a word. The storekeeper's son waved shyly from the hitching post. But Caleb knew better than to trust the silence. Kindness in these parts was often a thin veneer over old prejudices. The past proved him right on a brittle autumn morning. Hannah spotted the rider first, her gaze sharp as a hawk's as she hung laundry on the line. A figure cut across the horizon, lone and deliberate, his horse kicking up dust that glittered like ash in the sunlight. She didn't call out, just froze, her hands tightening on the damp cloth until her knuckles turned white. Caleb followed her line of sight, his stomach coiling at the sight of the man's narrow shoulders and the telltale slouch of his hat. The brother-in-law, alone this time, but the threat lingered in his posture like a blade half-sheathed. Caleb reached for the rifle before he even thought to move, his boots crunching against gravel as he stepped onto the porch. Hannah beat him to the yard, her skirts snapping in the wind like a flag raised in defiance. "Leave," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a whip, "or I'll shoot." The man halted, his eyes flicking between her and the rifle now cradled in Caleb's grip. For a heartbeat, he hesitated, a twitch of his horse's reins, a glance at the scarred earth where the fire had devoured their old life. Then he turned and rode off, his retreat slow and mocking, as though testing whether they'd let him go. He vanished into the hills, but the weight of his presence lingered. That night, Hannah sat on the porch, her rifle across her lap, the lavender blooming at her feet. "He'll come back," she murmured, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood. Caleb didn't argue. He lit his pipe, the glow casting shadows that danced like ghosts on the barn wall. "Let him," he said, the words quiet but final. The baby stirred inside, a kick against her ribs, and she smiled faintly, her hand covering the movement as if to shield it from the world. The wind carried the scent of lavender and smoke, of earth and iron, weaving their fears and hopes into the same unyielding thread. They didn't speak again, but Hannah's shoulders eased, and when Caleb reached for her hand, she let him hold it, two callous palms pressed together, bracing for the storm they knew was coming. A storm brewed in the fall, the kind that rolled in low and heavy, its winds howling like wolves circling the edges of the world. The sky turned the color of bruised fruit, deep purples and bruised grays, as clouds swallowed the sun whole. Hannah stood on the porch, her shawl pulled tight against the chill, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the ribbon in her braid. She hummed, the sound threading through the air like a lifeline, weaving itself into the creak of the wind and the rustle of dry leaves. The melody was faint but steady, a tune she'd once buried beneath years of silence, now resurrected in fragments. Her voice trembled at the edges, as if testing whether the world would let it stay. The baby squirmed in Caleb's arms, his tiny fists clutching at the fabric of his father's coat, but Caleb rocked him slow and deliberate, his boots scuffing the warped porch boards in a rhythm only he could hear. Closing his eyes, Caleb let the storm's fury blur into the memory of another day, the first time he'd seen her. The alley behind the saloon had been a tomb of whispers then, the air thick with the sour tang of whiskey and complicity. Hannah had stood barefoot on cracked earth, her swollen belly a stark contrast to the hollows under her cheekbones, her silence louder than the crowd's murmurs. He remembered the way her eyes had locked onto his, pale and unblinking, as if daring him to see her not as a burden, but as a woman who still had choices left to make. That silence had been a wound, yes, but also a shield, a way to survive the world's sharp edges. Now, here she was, humming as the wind tore at the lavender she'd planted beneath the window, her voice trembling but unbroken. The storm outside was nothing like the ones they'd weathered before. The fire that consumed the barn, the riders who came with threats and rusted papers, the nights they'd sat in the dark clutching fear like a second skin. This storm was different. It was the kind that swept away dead leaves, that carved new paths through the land, that made room for roots to dig deeper. Hannah's hum grew bolder, the notes stretching into something almost like a lullaby, and Caleb felt the weight of the baby in his arms shift as the child yawned, his tiny eyelids fluttering shut. For the first time in years, Caleb's chest didn't ache with the ghost of Alice's cinnamon freckles or the memory of a child who'd never taken a breath. Instead, he felt the warmth of the boy pressed to his shoulder, the steady rhythm of Hannah's voice, the stubborn resilience of the lavender clinging to the soil despite the wind's rage. When he opened his eyes, Hannah was watching him, her gaze steady but soft, the storm shadows painting hollows in her cheeks. She didn't stop humming. Instead, she reached out, her fingers brushing the baby's back in a motion so gentle it barely registered. Caleb didn't speak either, but he shifted closer, their shoulders touching as the first drops of rain began to fall. The storm would pass, as storms always did, but the roots they'd grown together, tentative, tangled, relentless, would hold. Somewhere beyond the horizon, thunder growled, a reminder of all they'd survived. But here, on this porch, in this moment, the silence between them was no longer a wound. It was a promise, humming quietly beneath the storm's roar, waiting to bloom when the skies cleared. They held the second wedding beneath the cottonwood tree where Alice lay, its branches skeletal but steadfast against the autumn sky. The ceremony was quiet, deliberate, a contrast to the chaos of their first vows, whispered in a courthouse just hours before the brother-in-law's threats reached their peak. Hannah stood at Caleb's side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her new wedding band glinting faintly in the dappled light. She wore a dress of soft blue, the ribbon from her braid catching the breeze like a flag of surrender to this life she'd fought so hard to claim. The guests were few but present. Clara, the storekeeper's wife with her hands still dusted in flour, the young neighbor boy clutching a jar of honey as a gift. No preacher this time, just the wind and the rustle of leaves that sounded like applause. When the vows ended, Hannah lingered at the foot of Alice's grave, her fingers brushing the rough stone marker. She placed a single flower there, a sprig of lavender, its scent mingling with the earthy tang of turned soil. Not for jealousy, though the ghosts of the past still stirred in the corners of her mind. Not for rivalry, but for gratitude. For the woman who had taught Caleb how to love, who had planted the seeds of kindness he still carried like heirlooms. For the cradle she'd built, The quilt she'd stitched, the silence she'd left behind that Hannah had learned to fill. "Thank you," she murmured, the words barely audible, though Caleb noticed the shift in her posture, a softening, a release. He didn't speak, just stepped beside her, their shoulders brushing as the wind tugged at his coat. At the reception, a makeshift gathering of bread, jam, and tin cups of cider, Clara raised her glass, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "May the child carry both their names," she declared, her gaze sweeping over the baby swaddled in Hannah's arms. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of what had been lost and what had been forged. Caleb's throat tightened as he looked down at the boy, his dark hair already curling at the edges, his tiny fists clutching at Hannah's dress like he knew to hold onto the world that had fought so hard to keep him. He did carry both names. Caleb, for the husband Hannah had buried. Caleb, for the father who had chosen her. A bridge between lives, between wounds, between the silence that once defined them and the hum that now filled their home. In Cold Creek, they became a story unto themselves. The man who spoke little but protected much, his rifle never far, his gaze steady when trouble lurked. The woman once sold at auction, now seen walking the porch each morning with her coffee, her voice lifting in that tentative hum that had grown fuller with each passing season. And the child, born in the middle of their storms, whose laughter spilled through the house like sunlight through cracks in a shutter. Townsfolk stopped whispering altogether. They nodded when the couple rode into town. Hannah's chin lifted, Caleb's hand resting on a rifle across his lap. They bought extra seeds when Hannah asked, offered tips for soothing colic, left bundles of firewood on the porch without comment. Respect, earned not through grand gestures, but through the quiet persistence of showing up, day after day, fire after fire, threat after threat. And for those who doubted whether broken things could bloom, those who muttered that a woman once auctioned could never stand tall, that a man with grief in his bones could never build anew, Hannah had her answer. She lived it, in the tomatoes that ripened along the fence, in a lavender that thrived despite the wind, in a cradle that now rocked a second child, its frame worn smooth by the passage of time and love. She lived it in the way Caleb's hand found hers without thinking, in the way the boy ran to meet her at the barn, his arms outstretched and his cheeks flushed with the joy of a world that had finally softened. The cottonwood tree stood behind them, its roots tangled with Alice's bones and the promises they'd made to each other. Above, the sky stretched endless and open, the same sky that had witnessed their first meeting, the alley, the silence, the auctioneer's sneer. But now it saw something else. A family carved not from blood or law, but from choice, from fire, from silence that had become speech and wounds that had become roots. Hannah didn't need to say it aloud. The proof was in the soil, in the child's laughter, in the way she hummed as she folded laundry, her voice no longer broken but brave. Broken things could bloom. They just needed the right hands to tend them, the kind that knew how to hold without clinging, how to heal without erasing, how to begin again, even when the world insisted on burning down around them.